The millstone turned, and with it, something ancient stirred. At 3:17 a.m. on a rain-sickened October morning in 1854, the last known sound to escape the Hartwell mill was not the grind of grain, but a woman's scream, brittle and short, as if cut off by a closing door. Her name was Eleanor Graft, and history has no record of her death. Not in local papers, not in census ledgers, not in church records. She was 21 years old, pregnant, and working as a cleaner in the mill's South Annex. Her family claimed she moved west, but they said it too quickly, as if they had rehearsed the lie. The mill stood on the outskirts of Dovetail Hollow, Connecticut, a sleepy Puritan holdover nestled between a failed rail line and a dying forest. Founded in 1801, the town had less than 500 people, yet more than half were employed, directly or indirectly, by the Hartwell Grain Company, a milling empire run by twin brothers Thaddeus and Elijah Hartwell. The town relied on them, prayed with them, feared them. No outsider questioned what happened to Eleanor. Why would they? The mill's chimney still smoked, the bell still rang, and every Sunday, the Hartwells sat in the front pew at St. Lita's Chapel, heads bowed in reverence, hands stained the color of flour and something darker. But this isn't a story about Eleanor alone. This is a story about what the mill really ground, and how generations of Dovetail Hollow were taught to forget what their bones still remembered. Something waits beneath the stone, and it's still turning. One was fire, one was ash. Together, they opened something no man should ever touch. The Hartwell twins were born in 1810 under a blood moon. That's not metaphor. It was recorded in the town's almanac by Reverend Malachi Finch himself. Born minutes apart, the boys were identical in appearance, but violently opposite in nature. Thaddeus, the firstborn, was all discipline, cold eyes, rigid spine, a mouth that never quite smiled. Elijah was softer, gentle voice, curious, too. Curious, some said. He was often seen alone in the woods behind the mill pond, sketching things. Strange things, carvings, circles, creatures. Their father, Josiah Hartwell, founded the mill with money no one could trace. Rumors said it came from a church sale in Massachusetts that burned down under suspicious circumstances. Others whispered of land trades with the dead plots stolen from unmarked graves, of a forgotten tribe the town still won't name. When Josiah died in 1832, found hanging, but his feet touching the ground, the twins inherited everything: land, wealth, power, and the book. Yes, the Hartwell Codex, bound in leather too smooth to be cowhide. No one outside the family was allowed to read it. The ledger held strange margin symbols next to names. Names crossed out in ink that never faded. Those who glimpsed it spoke of a gate and of keeping it sealed through sacrifice. By 1835, the twins expanded the mill, but the expansion didn't make sense. New basements were dug, huge, cavernous, windowless, and workers were not allowed inside after sunset. When asked why, Thaddeus would simply say, "The gate groans when it's cold. We must keep it quiet." And yet, the sounds only grew louder. So loud, Eleanor began to hear them in her sleep. Hair like wheat, eyes like rot. She followed no one, but everyone heard her. Before she vanished, Eleanor Graff was known for her silence. She spoke little, smiled even less, not because she was cold, but because she was listening. She arrived in Dovetail Hollow in the spring of 1852, sent by the St. Agnes Orphan House for Wayward Girls in New Haven. No mother, no father, just a note pinned to her collar: keep her away from running water. The Hartwells offered her work in the mill, cleaning, late hours, no questions. The townsfolk didn't trust her, said she walked strangely, that her eyes didn't track like they should. But the children, especially the younger boys, loved her. They called her Thresh, a name that came from her hair, which always seemed to move when the millstones did. Eleanor said little, but she wrote journals filled with symbols, spirals, repeating names, most of them dead. Pages and pages of nonsense, the church claimed, but not everyone believed that. The town's oldest midwife, Martha Dorr, said Eleanor carried something ancient inside her. Not a baby in memory, something borrowed from a time before the town, before the mill, before even the forest had a name. 2 weeks before she vanished, Eleanor began bleeding from the ears during her night shifts. Said the mill was whispering to her, said it knew her real name, that the grain wasn't grain, that it was pulled from something with teeth. Her last journal entry, smudged in what appears to be bone ash, reads only, "The gate is open. It remembers me. It wants back in. That page is missing from the town archive, but in the cellar of the old Hartwell mill is nailed to a support beam with her hair. It bled from the center, not red, but black, like oil, like memory. At the heart of Dovetail Hollow stands St. Lita's Chapel, built in 1805 from stones carried by hand from the nearby river bed. The walls are damp year-round, slick with moss that never dies. The air inside always smells like old teeth. St. Lita's was the only church in town, and like everything else, it belonged to the Hartwells. The Reverend Finch gave the sermons. It was Thaddeus Hartwell who chose the scripture, Elijah who paid the choir, and the altar, built from the same black wood used to frame the mill's oldest gears. No one knows where that timber came from, only that it bends light strangely and is always warm to the touch. The focal point of the chapel was its crucifix, a towering wooden carving of St. Lita herself, eyes hollow, mouth open as if mid-scream. According to doctrine, Lita was a Roman martyr, skinned alive for refusing to deny the first gate, a story no one could verify. And yet carved into every pew was her symbol, a key splitting an eye. In half in late October 1854, 2 nights after Eleanor's scream echoed through the mill, something happened in St. Lita's. During evening prayer, the crucifix began to weep, not tears, but thick, black fluid like burnt sap or oil. It leaked from the carved eyes and pooled on the altar cloth. The congregation sat in stunned silence until Elijah Hartwell stood and said, "She's not dead. She's remembering." Then he collapsed, seizing violently, chanting in a language no one recognized. Reverend Finch closed the chapel for ray sanctification. It never reopened. Within a week, every member of the choir left town, everyone, except the organist, who was found days later with her hand stuffed in her own mouth. They said grace. Then they devoured something they never planted, and no one asked where it came from. Every November, just before the snow sealed Dovetail Hollow out from the rest of the state, the Hartwells hosted what they called the meal before winter. It was a town-wide gathering, always held in the long hall behind the mill, a feast for the workers, a thank you for another harvest. But no one ever saw the harvest wagons arrive. The grain stores were always full, but the fields around the town hadn't been worked in months, not since the soil turned gray and the cattle began birthing eyeless calves. Even the trees leaned away from the mill by then as if something below had begun to breathe. Still, no one refused the invitation, not in a town where saying no to the Hartwells meant losing your roof, or worse, your children, because orphan children always found work at the mill, and those who disappeared were quickly replaced by others who knew not to ask questions. The food was odd, heavy, rich, the meat dark and tough, always served with a thick, bitter syrup was never named. But after the second bite, people stopped caring. They laughed, they sang, they forgot. Even grief faded at that table. Every year, the same blessing was read aloud by Thaddeus, by the gate that opens, by the mouth that takes. By the bone we grind, we give thanks. Only Elijah never ate. He sat at the head of the table, hands folded, lips trembling, watching the townsfolk feed Dot and Eleanor. She never attended. That year, her room was found empty. The bedsheet shredded into prayer shapes, her window latch carved, with symbols from the CODEX. And on her pillow, a single, uncooked kernel of grain, still warm, still breathing. It didn't hold knowledge, it held hunger. The Codex didn't teach, it consumed. The Hartwell Codex was not a book in the normal sense. Bound in dark, modeled leather with a texture like dried tongue, its pages were brittle, but never aged. Town legend said it was not written, but grown fed over decades with things not meant to be read aloud. Only Thaddeus and Elijah Hartwell were allowed to touch it, but one man claimed he saw it open. Samuel Catch, the mill's assistant floor manager, was tasked with taking inventory late one night after Thaddeus fell ill. While searching the ledger drawer, he opened the wrong cabinet and found the Codex, just for a moment, long enough. He would later tell his sister, who committed him to an asylum in Danvers, that the book did not have words, but rows of tiny, perfect teeth pressed into the pages, and that when he leaned close, it whispered his mother's voice. From beneath the paper, "You were supposed to die in the river, Sammy. You were supposed to feed the wheel." Catch went blind 3 days later, burned out his own eyes with lye soap, and said it was to keep the margins from staring back. When the Reverend visited him in the asylum, Catch gave one final warning: the Codex isn't theirs. They didn't write it. They only woke it up, and now it's chewing through time. After that, Cass disappeared from his room, from the records, from memory. But in 1952, almost a century later, a piece of paper surfaced during renovations at St. Lita's. It was a torn page from the codex. On it, drawn in blood and ash, was a millstone encircled with children's teeth. It rang at hours no one remembered. It called only the forgotten, and it had no rope. Atop the Hartwell mill stood a tower unusually high for a grain facility. Brickwork blackened by decades of smoke, crowned with a belfry. The bell inside was massive, cast from metal, not mined anywhere near Connecticut. The townspeople called it the throat. It rang 3 times a day, 6 a.m., noon, and sunset, always without fail, always precise. But there was one problem. There was no rope, no pulley, no mechanism. The bell rang on its own. Workers said it vibrated the bones in their teeth, that every time it rang, someone in the town would sleepwalk. Most were found unharmed, standing in cornfields, submerged in shallow ponds, curled up at the foot of the church altar, with dirt under their nails. But others were not so lucky. One child, Maren Talbot, was found inside the mill's storage drum, her body intact, but entirely hollowed out like the grain had passed through her. Another, a boy named Isaac Rell, walked straight into the river and never surfaced. When they dragged the net a week later, they pulled up no body but a burlap sack full of MOLA or S. Each tooth carved with a single symbol, the key, the gate. Elijah Hartwell once hinted the bell was a gift from the soil, that it didn't need a ringer because the gate always knows who's next. In 1891, a former worker returned to Dovetail Hollow after nearly 40 years in exile. He stood at the foot of the bell tower and screamed, "It's not a bell, it's a mouth, and it's calling for the rest of us." Then he lit himself on fire. The bell rang 7 times that night. The next morning, the river ran backward. They came with empty names and left with none. They were the perfect offering and claimed, unloved, unseen. Just beyond the northern tree line, at the edge of where the town's map ends and the woods begin, stood a house made of whitewashed stone and scorched oak. The locals called it Ash House, though its true name, long scraped from the signboard, was the Hartwell Home for Discarded Youth. It was not a proper orphanage. There were no records sent to the state, no known benefactors. The children arrived quietly, delivered by nameless men in gray coats. Some were from nearby towns. Some were said to be from as far as New York or Pennsylvania. All were under 10. All were given new names, single syllables like Rue, Lynn, Vex, Soul, easier, perhaps, to forget. What little oversight there was came from Elijah Hartwell. Who cared for the children in a way only the town's silence allowed? He gave them books, games, food, but never sugar, never salt, and never mirrors. The children were kept on strict routine, prayer at dawn, grinding duty at mid-morning, isolation in the cold room after sundown. When asked what they ground, the children would often pause, then whisper, memories, local. Boys dared each other to knock on Ash House windows after dark. Most never tried, but one boy, Harlan Croft, did. He claimed to have seen the children sitting in rows on the floor, all with their mouths open, as if in silent song. Behind them, a blackboard covered in shapes that moved, even when no one touched them. Harlan vanished 2 days later. His shoes were found at the mill's foundation. Inside them, a note scrawled in childish handwriting. "We weren't born. We were made." The gate feeds first on what was never wanted. They said the harvest was blessed, but the wheat had veins, and sometimes it screamed. In late autumn of 1854, just days after Eleanor's disappearance and the bleeding crucifix at St. Lita's, a strange phenomenon swept the Hartwell Mill's grain stores. The wheat stored in tightly sealed silos, imported from unlisted farmlands the workers never visited, began to rot, but not like any known spoilage. The rot was warm, and it spread upward against gravity. It emitted a smell like milk and rust wheat, and nauseating and carried flies that didn't land, only hovered. One night, when the west silo was being cleaned out for burning, 2 men, Gideon and Thomas Reef, were sent in. They never came back out. The next morning, the door was unbolted. Inside, both men were found suspended in the air, their mouths full of wheat, not choking, feeding, their eyes rolled back, locked in rapture. When pulled down, their tongues were found sewn to the roof of their mouths with threads made of braided root fibers, likely from the surrounding forest. But the most disturbing part, when a small portion of the grain was sent to a botanist in Hartford for analysis, the letter came back burned. Only a few words were legible beneath the scorch marks. This isn't plant. It's tissue, fibrous, yes, but organic, possibly neural, possibly the rest was lost. One former worker, who touched the grain barehanded, developed a red rash shaped like spirals, which never healed. He claimed he could hear whispering through the burlap sacks. "It's not food," he muttered before vanishing into the woods. "It's the gate's breath, waiting to be swallowed." That year, the bread made from Hartwell flour turned darker, heavier. Townsfolk said it bled if you tore it too fast, and the children at Ash House began laughing in their sleep. They didn't sing to remember. They sang to keep it asleep. Beneath the main structure of the Hartwell mill was a network of root cellars, supposedly built for grain storage. But those who worked the lower levels whispered that the rooms were too deep, too wide, and far too cold for wheat, and they were always wet. In the winter of 1854, a newly hired groundsman, Edgar Mallon, reported hearing voices beneath the floorboards during his night shift, low chanting, repeating phrases that made no sense except for one word he could never forget, virile. When Mallon asked Elijah Hartwell what it meant, Elijah went still, as if trapped in a memory he hadn't summoned. Then, softly, "It's not a word, it's a name, but not one we're allowed to say unless we're ready to feed it." Mallon quit that night, but he didn't leave town. He stayed to investigate. He broke into the lower root cellar with a rusted crowbar and a half-lit lantern. What he found was not storage, not even ritual. He found children, 4 of them, sitting cross-legged on the floor in identical white garments, eyes open but entirely black. No pupils, no iris, just obsidian glass reflecting the lantern light. They were humming, something, soft, syncopated, a lullaby without words. But the melody, it moved, it pressed against the walls, made the air ripple. The flame bent toward them, and behind the children, the wall was breathing. When Mallon ran, he swore he saw roots growing out of the stone, thin, vein like threads, twisting upward, pulsing in rhythm with the hymn. The next morning, the door to the root cellar was gone, bricked over, seamless, as if it had never been there. And Edgar Mallon was found weeks later face down in the pond, ears filled with grain, dust. Still water holds memory, and when it reflects something wrong, it means something beneath wants out. The milkman behind Hartwell Mill was man-made, dug by hired laborers over the long summers. In the 1830s, it was meant to power the lower, grinding wheels through a canal sluice, but even when the canal froze over, the pond remained liquid. Always, locals avoided it. Animals wouldn't drink from it, and children who fell in weren't always found. It was called the Mirror by the orphans at Ash House. Old maps from the early 1800s show that the pond sits directly atop a collapsed burial field, a ceremonial site once used by the displaced Quinnipiac tribe. The ground was never consecrated. In fact, it was warned against, but the Hartwells chose it deliberately. Some say Elijah believed the water was a kind of skin, a membrane separating our world from something buried beneath, something watching. In the fall of 1854, shortly after Eleanor Graff vanished, townspeople began reporting reflections in the water that didn't match reality. A man fishing at dusk saw his face blink, but he hadn't. A child throwing rocks claimed the pond grew a mouth and whispered his name, and a milkmaid walking past said she saw Eleanor, naked, standing on the far side though the bank was empty. Most disturbing of all, during the final dredging attempt in 1860, the crew pulled up a slab of carved black stone, shaped like a millstone but with an eye in the center and 12 teeth around its rim. The moment it broke the surface, the water turned red. Not cloudy, not stirred, red, thick and hot, like blood pumped fresh from a throat, and floating just beneath the ripples, dozens of open, watching eyes, not human, not fish, but something older and angry. The stone was returned to the depths. The Melpin has never run dry since. Grief must close to let the dead rest. But in Dovetail Hollow, sorrow became a door that never latched. In a town that buried its secrets beneath prayer and ash, death was never final. The church bells tolled, black veils were worn, and dirt was shoveled. But no one in Dovetail Hollow ever truly grieved, because they weren't allowed to. Each death, especially those tied to the mill, was met with a rigid ritual, enforced by Thaddeus Hartwell himself. No open caskets, no eulogies, no stories from the living, just a silent procession from the chapel to the backfield cemetery, where coffins were lowered in darkness and prayers were muttered in a language no one else spoke. Some said it was Latin, others said it was older, but in 1854, during the final week of October, So many people died or vanished that the town could no longer keep pace. 10 funerals in 7 days, but no graves. Witnesses say the coffins were never opened. Some looked far too small, others far too heavy. One casket marked only with a wheat symbol was seen leaking a black, syrupy liquid through the seams. No one spoke of it again. What's stranger is that the mourning didn't stop, even months later. The weeping never ceased. People would hear sobbing in alleyways, behind walls, beneath floorboards. A sound like distant wailing, layered with whispers as though the dead had begun to comfort each other, or warn each other. One woman, June Brattle, attempted to hold a true wake for her lost son killed in the mill press. She hosted it in secret. Candles, his photograph, the cradle he never grew out of. That night, her house burned down. All that remained was the cradle untouched by flame and a note nailed to the door, written in a child's hand. No more remembering. It's almost full. Full of what? We weren't supposed to ask. They believed they were eating bread, but what they consumed was memory made dust and dust made flesh again. By the winter of 1854, the town's food stores were nearly gone. The ground had gone sour, livestock birthed still, and even the wild deer had stopped appearing near the edge of the woods. But the Hartwells had flour always loaves were distributed every Sunday from the mill's side hatch. Dense, dark bread rich, and steaming even in the bitter cold. It didn't mold. It didn't go stale. And after eating it, no one dreamed. People lined up for it, fought for it. Some claimed it healed wounds, made them feel young again. Others said it tasted like ash and iron. No one knew where it came from, that is, until Father Ulrich Webb, a new arrival from the Diocese of Hartford, began investigating the town's practices. Young, devout, and unafraid of local superstition, Father Webb attended a Sunday distribution unannounced. He took one loaf and disappeared into his rectory for 5 days. When he emerged, he was barefoot, shaking, and his teeth were blackened. He held in his hand a small vial of gray dust. "There is nothing of wheat in this," he told a fellow priest in a hastily scrawled letter. "It's not grain. It's pulverized tissue with bone particulate, but not animal. The calcium readings are too clean, too symmetrical, human, perhaps, or close." His last words to the priest were, "It remembers being whole." That same night, Father Webb choked to death during Mass. The bread he'd eaten for communion tore his throat from the inside out. The medical examiner said it was like swallowing a handful of needles. Later, beneath the church floorboards, a buried sack was found. Inside, more flour and dozens of tiny finger bones, each carved with the gate's symbol. In Dovetail Hollow, time wasn't kept. It was hidden, and one man tried to wind it the wrong way. Nathaniel Burr was the town's only clockmaker, a quiet man, elderly even in 1854, who lived alone in a squat cottage between the post office and the southern tree line. He didn't attend church, didn't speak at town meetings. He simply repaired clocks except when he didn't. Because in Dovetail Hollow, time didn't behave like it should. Witnesses reported watches stopping for hours, only to resume ticking as if nothing had passed. The town bell rang early some days, late others, and the children of Ash House claimed entire nights vanished, like they went to bed and woke in the same instant. Dopper took notice. He began writing time logs, observing, comparing the mill's bell tower chimes with the sun's position. The discrepancies grew each week by seconds, then minutes, then entire hours. But the more he studied it, the less he slept. He said his own clocks had begun ticking without springs, that they moved before he touched them, that the hands were spinning to places that didn't exist. In December of that year, Burr attempted to build a new device, a regulator, meant to correct the town's distortion. He crafted it from scrap metal, teeth from old watches, and a strange gear found behind the mill, a gear too warm to be metal and too soft to be stone. When activated, the regulator let out a piercing hum and began to glow faintly. Then all clocks in town stopped. Simultaneously, for 6 full minutes, Dovetail Hollow was silent. No wind, no birds, not even breath. Then the regulator shattered violently, its pieces embedded in Burr's face like shrapnel. Before dying, Burr scrawled one final line on his wall, using his own blood. "They don't want time fixed, because the gate feeds on what we lose." After that day, every sundial in town showed a different hour, and one clock at St. Lita's began ticking backward, with no weights inside. They woke, they worked, they wept, but nothing moved, not time, not hunger, not the dying. It was January 7th, 1855, the first Sunday of the new year. Snow blanketed Dovetail Hollow in a silence so perfect, it was almost hostile. The trees didn't sway. The mill's chimney stood still. No wind, no birds, only breath, and the constant tolling of the bell. It rang 37 times, though no one ever pulled the rope because there was no rope. The townsfolk woke and went about their day. Morning prayer, midday bread, evening hush, but by sunset, something was wrong. No one had changed. Children remained hungry, though they had eaten. Wounds didn't heal, but didn't worsen. Candles burned, but never melted. Shadows stayed frozen in place, stretching in the wrong direction. Time had stopped, but the day didn't end. They tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Even blinking became difficult. Like the air had thickened, resisting every attempt to move forward. The town, Dr. Elias Rowe, attempted to test the phenomenon by marking a series of incisions on his own arm and waiting for blood. None came. The cuts remained fresh, dry, unbleeding. He wrote, "We're trapped in something's gaze, like insects on the eye of a god that refuses to blink." At Ash House, the orphans began singing the Root Cellar hymn again, but slower, this time drawn out, as if each note was being chewed and swallowed. One girl, Vex, walked to the chapel and stared at the stained glass window for hours. When someone asked her what she was looking at, she whispered, "She's coming through." Not a god, a shape, made of us. The sun never fully set that night. It hovered just above the tree line for 31 hours before finally disappearing. And when it did, the temperature dropped suddenly to zero, and everyone aged a year overnight. Bones ached, hair whitened. One child turned to dust in her sleep. From that Sunday forward, every clock in town ticked slightly faster than before. It was bound in leather, but it pulsed, warm, damp, like a lung that never exhaled fully. In March of 1855, Father Silas, keenkeeper of St. Lita's Parish, received an unmarked crate. No return address, no delivery record. Inside was a book, a ledger, unlike any he had seen. Its pages were stitched together not with thread, but with what he described as fibrous, nerve-like roots. The ink shimmered, the spine had pores, and when held close, it exhaled. He called it the Blood Tithe Register. At first, it appeared to be a record of the town's orphans' names, birth dates, the date they were taken in by the church, but within days, the ledger began adding entries on its own, names that weren't known, children who didn't exist, ages that ran backward, causes of death marked as unborn, swallowed, or devoured by ASH. Father Keene tried to burn it. The flame recoiled. He buried it beneath the chapel only to find it resting the next morning on the altar, open to a new page each, name written in fresh red, always red. And then the dreams began. He saw rows of children, standing on a shore of bones, their mouths sewn shut with fishing line, pointing toward something in the sea of vast, throbbing eye, watching them from beneath the waves of black salt water. One child in the dream spoke directly into his mind. The register remembers. It does not record the dead. It decides who never was. The next morning, Keene found his own name, Father Silas Emery Keene, aged 47, written on the last page. But the date of entry was 4 days. In the future, he vanished on that exact date, and in his place, the church gained a new child, a girl no one remembered birthing. She sat in the front pew every morning after, quietly humming the Root Cellar hymn. Backward, she walked into town barefoot, soaked to the skin, with mud on her dress and no eyes in her head, but she was smiling. Her name was Eleanor Vance, widow of a millwright and presumed dead. She had vanished 6 years earlier during a thunderstorm. Her rowboat found shattered on the bank of Mirror Lake, its oars missing, its hull clawed through, not broken, not weathered. Clawed. The town mourned her. A plaque hung in the church. A cradle she had been knitting for a child that never came remained unfinished in her home. They had moved on. Until the night she came back, April 3rd, 1855. Just after dusk, she emerged from the woods, her dress torn and soaked, her bare feet leaving no prints in the mud. Her hair was longer now, knotted with black feathers and tiny, rotting teeth. But it was her face that made the crowd fall silent, where her eyes once were. The sockets were sealed with skin, not scarred, not damaged, as if they had never existed. Her mouth, however, smiled wide to wide, and when she spoke, it wasn't her voice. It was a chorus, a dozen whispers behind her teeth, speaking as one. She was never lost. She was borrowed. She refused food. She never slept. For days, she stood in the center of town, whispering to the air, occasionally tilting her head as if listening to something none of the others could hear. The orphans began mimicking her posture, tilting their heads in perfect unison at the same times. One boy screamed when Eleanor touched him. He screamed for 46 minutes until his vocal cords ruptured before collapsing. He managed to say, "She showed me the first place where the mothers drowned themselves to become stars." Eleanor vanished again the following week. Only a trail of feathers and teeth led back into the wood's ending. At the mouth of the old root cellar, Dot, and inside, scratched onto the stone walls in blood, "She's making room for more." It was never just a cellar. It was a mouth, and someone or something had just decided to open it. For generations, the Hartwell Mills root cellar was an ignored relic, sealed shut, forgotten, rumored to hold nothing but the bones of old grain harvests. But after Eleanor's return and disappearance, something began happening at night. The floorboards above the cellar bowed upward. A sulfuric stench crept through the cracks. Orphans reported hearing lullabies, sung in dialects that predated English languages even the church's archives could not identify. And then, on May 1st, 1855, the earth shifted literally. The orchard behind the mill, once lush with peaches and pears, rotted overnight. Every tree withered, their roots coiling away from the cellar as if trying to escape. And that morning, the door to the root cellar, which had been sealed shut, with 7 iron locks hung open, Dot inside. No dust, no cobwebs, no sign of age. The stairs descended deeper than the foundation should allow, far deeper than was architecturally possible. Father Garvey, the new parish overseer, descended with 2 men and a lantern. They were gone for 4 hours. Only one returned. He was in the same. Jonas Lau, the cooper's apprentice, came back naked, teeth missing, fingernails split down the center, and speaking in perfect Latin despite being illiterate. He whispered a single sentence before collapsing. "In seizure, non-descenderant, ascenderant." They did not go down. They came up. He died 31 minutes later, with a smile identical to Eleanor's. After that, the orphans began drawing spirals in ash on the walls, always with the same phrase beneath, "It is open now." The Hartwell brothers ordered the cellar resealed, this time with concrete and prayer. But the next morning, the concrete was cracked, and on the back wall, written in wet ash, "Do not bury the mouth, bury the tongue." When the townspeople broke through the drywall of the orphanage, they expected rats. Instead, they found fingernails. It started with the smell, a sour sweet scent, like rotting fruit mixed with lavender, seeping from the walls of the north wing, where children had recently begun sleepwalking in groups, eyes open, mouths moving, but producing no sound. Father Garvey ordered the walls inspected. Behind the paneling, they found bones. Tiny bones, stacked neatly, skulls still bearing the milk teeth of toddlers, each jaw forced open with what appeared to be blackened iron nails. The walls were filled with them, not a dozen, not even 100, 206 to 7 child-sized skeletons packed inside the support beams and insulation. None of them matched the current roster of orphans, and not a single record existed of their identities. These children had never been registered. These children had never been counted. But it was what they found carved into the inside of the skulls that drove the inspectors mad. A repeated series of symbol spirals, hands with missing fingers, open eyes with bleeding pupils, and one phrase, etched in Latin beneath each, "Servus vocis," servant of the voice. When the coroner tried to transport the bones, his cartwheel splintered, throwing the contents into the road as the townspeople rushed to collect them. A loud sound echoed from the orphanage, children singing, but not from inside. From within the walls themselves. Later that night, one of the nuns was found dead, her mouth stitched shut with hair, and the words they were promised to choir burned into her back with a branding iron. After that, the remaining staff attempted to abandon the building, but no one could leave. Those who tried found themselves back at the front gate. Despite walking in the opposite direction for hours, the orphanage had become a loop, a maze, a prison for a song that refused to die. And from then on, the children began whispering a new phrase in their sleep. The grain was never the offering. It was the silence. The mill was never for grain. It was a mouth that fed on what grain could never satisfy. Obedient silence, carved into the living. In the fall of 1855, the entire town of Dunwich Hollow vanished from census records, not due to fire, not flood, not war. Just Absence. Mail stopped being delivered. Trains ceased their stops. And when an inquiry was launched by the Connecticut State Bureau, the inspector sent to locate the town, Mr. Isaiah Clem simply wrote, "There is no Dunwich Hollow. It is a misprint." And that was that. For over 170 years, no further investigation was made. But in October of 1949, a Yale folklore student named Clara Elsner found a journal hidden in the wall of an abandoned parish library 50 miles outside Hartford. It bore no title, no author, just a symbol on the cover, a spiral wrapped in thorn vines. Inside were first-hand entries from the Hartwell brothers dated after their deaths had already been recorded. In them, they wrote of a final ritual, a harvest not of grain, but of speech. The Root Cellar, it claimed, was a birthing chamber for an ancient force that consumed language itself, not words, voice, will, identity. Every orphan we silenced, every tongue cut, fed it. Each mute became a choir member, a voice turned inward. The harvest was not physical. It was spiritual starvation, a stripping away of names. The final entry simply read, "We have spoken the long. It hears us now. The mill must grind again." Clara Elsner disappeared 1 month later. All that remained in her dorm was the journal open to a blank page and a recording device running a continuous loop of static. But if you listen closely, very closely, you'll hear what investigators claimed was just a glitch, a whisper in the static. "Hush, the tongue was never yours." This was the story of the Hartwell brothers, the mill that ground more than grain, forgotten by history, preserved in silence. And now finally heard.